Welcome everyone to this session of Next Practices Live. If you've been with us before, you understand our understanding of the moment we all find ourselves in, that none of us have been down this road before. There is no best practice. All we can do are next practices. What are we going to try next? What are we going to learn from that? But of course, it's really hard to learn from other people if you're in lockdown. So we launched this series of seminars specifically to address that issue, to let people hear from experts and then talk also with the experts amongst themselves, trying to understand how things are being done around the world and to see what's working and what might not be working, at least what the lessons are. So we're very fortunate to have two experts with us today. And let me just very briefly introduce them to you. First is Dr. Bronwyn Howell. She's a senior lecturer at Victoria University in New Zealand. She's a senior research associate with PURC and also an adjunct scholar with the American Enterprise Institute. And that's where I first met her, was there. Miguel Weldt is the vice president and legal and corporate affairs at VTR in Chile. VTR is the largest fixed broadband provider in Chile and also the largest provider of subscription television. So thank you both for being here and willing to share your time, share your expertise with our audience. So let's just jump right into this. And I'll start with you, Bronwyn. Could you tell us a little bit about how the pandemic has affected how customers are using telecommunications technologies?
Good morning, everyone. And it's morning in New Zealand, afternoon in the US. Thank you, Mark, for this opportunity to join the conversation. I think there's two different ways of looking at this. There's the effects that the pandemic has had on residential use of the technology and the effect that it's had on commercial provision. Clearly, with people working from home, there's been a big transition of people using their networks from their home environments rather than at their work environments. So that's shifted where a lot of the work traffic is coming from. Second, there's been a huge increase in home traffic as people who are not working are now at home using recreational use of the internet. So that's caused both a huge traffic volume and a change in the location that the traffic is coming from. And that's put some pressures on where the fine-tuning of the networks have been deployed and leading to different patterns of congestion that have been observed before. It's also put some stresses on what's happened at the enterprise level, particularly for firms that are using virtual private networks, because they've also got the additional problem of having to retune their own networks as well, because prior to the pandemic, the firms were having most of their traffic generated from within their networks, but now most of their traffic is coming from outside the network into the enterprise and then out to the rest of the world. So that's led to challenges at different points. And the third issue is, if we're at home, most of us are now using Wi-Fi at home to be able to move our messages around. So we're also putting stresses on our home Wi-Fi networks because of, first of all, more people in the household means that some people are going to be further away from where they were previously, but also the sheer volumes of traffic that are coming within the home networks too.
All right, well, thank you. Miguel, what are your experiences so far in Chile and the experiences you're learning from your colleagues in nearby countries?
It's quite alike. First of all, hello everybody, and thank you for this invitation. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, and Bronwyn, the experience we are having is exactly the same. In our case, for example, we are a B2C based company. We have not that much B2B business, and what we've seen is an incredibly increase of amount of traffic over our networks, basically coming from traffic that used to be on B2C, B2B, where companies were closed, people were curfewed or decided for safety to move to homes. And suddenly from one moment to the other, we saw that applications changed, amount of people using the network during mornings was materially different. All the traffic moved and was much more steady because we kind of received the old B2B traffic into B2C networks, which, by the way, weren't always prepared for that. And on the other side, we also saw that on the mobile side, a lot of traffic came into the fixed side, and people that used to move from home to work would use the phone during the movement, the traffic movement, and would use the applications at the offices, lost it, and started using only our networks there. And that was also, it's very clear, because we received an increase of about 40% of the traffic basically in less than a week. The government on a Friday decided that from Monday there was going to be a curfew. Most of the companies decided to go home office, and we shifted like 40% of traffic to this networks. So it is clear that mobiles have only increased about 20%, and it has always been clear that the hours where the uses has changed. Now, one of the things that also changed was that at the beginning we had a lot of traffic from applications like Netflix. A lot of people were not able to work at home. They basically moved to home and had time, so started using streaming. YouTube and Netflix were the kings in this game. And we received a very strong relief like 2 weeks later, when Netflix and YouTube decided to limit the quality of the streaming, and that impacted about 12% of the amount of traffic that had increased. But on the other hand, we started seeing more applications, work applications starting to run. In our particular case, we have fiber to the home, but in a very limited number. Most of our network is HFC. And then we started seeing another difficulty, which was basically that we had designed the network to receive a lot of streaming. And now we were also pushing the network upwards, because people are doing things like the ones we're doing right now, sending our image and the voice. So we, at the speed of light, basically all our teams in less than 4 weeks have made expansions to the networks equal to almost all last year's expansion. And we are really short. So now we're working on the equivalent to 1 year expansion in the next 6 weeks. So from a network side, a lot of stress on the network. We did have a lot of international link capacity, where we also had an increase of about 40%, but we had a 400% capacity of growth, so there wasn't a limit there. So I wouldn't say that overbooking on the links has been a problem. That is something that technology was already able to deal with a lot of capacity on the links. But I think the last mile and the node side has been a difficulty. But we're dealing with that. And one interesting thing has been that even though this is a huge stress over the network, clients kind of were so used to have good quality and have always thought of the fixed world as something stable, that now that it's having trouble, because probably about 30% of the network is overstressed right now. So we're working on dealing with that problem. They wanted to work as if it was the same thing as before all this traffic that moved to the network. Like the crisis doesn't exist, and like we had the obligation to have a network that had the capacity to grow in a few days more than 50% of its capacity, and that it should have been prepared for that. And governments are lost on what is going on there. Why isn't it handling the traffic and the quality of service as it should? So we've been doing a lot of work on trying to first explain to the public what are the problems we're suffering, and second, explaining the government what are the amounts of traffic and what is the real what's the reality behind this phenomenon, which is huge. And I must say that governments are more empathic than clients, because this is incredibly material for them. People that want to work, need to work, don't have time to waste, and it is really difficult to give them the quality of service that they want all the time. But the good news is at least our networks are working, have not failed, and most of the traffic is being handled as of today.
All right, well, thank you, Miguel. So, Bronwyn, let me go back to you. Miguel was telling us that they had seen similar types of traffic pattern changes that you had described. And then he also went into how's this impacting the networks? What's their performance like? What have you seen in your experiences? How has this change in usage affected the networks? And then, of course, the consumer's experiences.
Well, in the New Zealand context, we've been especially fortunate because we've had a large amount of investment over the last few years, and the networks have been able to cope with little tweaks and adjustments at local levels, just readjusting the pipes at the local level to, as Miguel suggested, changing it so they could have a better experience of upstream traffic. And I think for countries like New Zealand and the United States that have had a lot of investment and have had a lot of duplicate or spare capacity, have been well specified to meet peaks, have been able to meet the challenges a lot better than countries that perhaps have been delivering more to demand rather than in advance. What we've seen though is, again, the adjustment of the applications, the change of the applications used has created pressures. But also in the enterprise environment, it's also meant that a lot of enterprises have had to think very carefully about how they've specified their networks. But where we've had some issues in New Zealand have been with some larger firms who hadn't been prepared for being able to have suddenly 100% of their workforce remote rather than only 10 or 20%. So that's caused some activity for the network engineering profession with specifying things better at the corporate level. Second, I think we've also had some pressures of people thinking that just because they've had an interruption in their transmission, it's automatically the network's problem and that the network can fix it. Whereas a lot of this has also been people's home networks have not been up to scratch, or particularly if everyone's working on Wi-Fi, then in fact the logjam is not on the network, it's actually in the house. And it could be, first of all, because the person using it is now at the far end of the house and is a long way from the modem, or there's a lot of traffic that's going on video streaming on devices. It's a huge demand on the network, and simple remedies that can be undertaken in the household, like just moving the vital traffic closer to the modem, or just using those old Ethernet cables and plugging the high definition streaming television or the game box into the modem, automatically takes that off the Wi-Fi network, so frees that up for the person who might be in the home office to be able to do their Skype call. So there's those sorts of things that are things that can be done by people themselves. It's not just an issue for the networks to solve or the regulators to solve. This is something that everyone has to be in right the way along the supply chain, from the consumers through to the enterprises.
No, thank you. Now, Miguel, I saw you nodding your head in a lot of that. So yeah, tell us about what that's like in Chile.
It's just the same thing. And what really surprises us is that this is like electricity in the sense that everybody knows what it is, but nobody really can explain how it works. And in some ways, you're starting to see that with our clients. Everybody uses the network, but they don't really know what the product is about, what are the limitations of the same technology they have inside. So, for example, little letters like N, B, C, J, and which describe what level of Wi-Fi you are using, describes a lot on what's the capacity, what the speeds can be. So clients just tell you, hey, I just hired and upgraded my my service from 400 megs to 600 megabytes of speed. Why isn't it working faster? And they start really complaining hard. And when they reach us, we have to ask them, well, what's your computer? Is it being used connected to the electricity system, or is it with the battery? No, it's with the battery. Well, that slows the speed on half of it. And what level is the Wi-Fi? What's the age of it? What's your phone? So there's so many things aside from the physical one, which is distance, is a huge difference. Inside homes, being behind the wall, being in between mirrors. You have so many subtleties that affect materially the quality of service that we're receiving huge amount of calls. So one of the problems we're facing is that a normal call center used to have, let's say, X amount of calls, and today it's receiving 200% increase. So it's doubled in less than a week. But at the same time, most of the people that used to attend those calls are at home. So because of COVID, they can't attend in the premises where they used to work. And the first problem we had was, how do you install and work from home huge call centers? So our capacity went down, the calls raised by 100%, and everybody was really requesting help because they were doing things that they didn't used to do, and the problem was at home. And by the way, fixed world is an euphemism today. Nobody has a wire. It's most of the things that we connect to the network don't have a plug-in where you can put the cable, except for TVs probably and some consoles. But phones, computers, tablets, they're basically Wi-Fi based, and that's not the strongest technology. So we're facing a lot of things with problems with the customer interface, and it's been tough, but we expect to get better on time, and we've been able to attend probably 85% of the calls, but still leaving uncontested 15% of the calls has a huge impact on the feeling our clients have before our company, and that's really difficult to handle today.
Yes, so Miguel, I'm going to follow up just a little bit on that, because if we go back quite a few years actually, in the days when telecommunications was regulated more, trying to help the customers with that kind of an issue would not have been allowed. Where your network ended, your discussion with the customer had to end as well. So it sounds like the kind of flexible, lower light-handed regulation has been important to your being able to adapt and be helpful. Could you describe that a little bit? And if I'm wrong, just say so.
No, you're right. But I would say, at least in the countries where we're working today, there's been a huge shift towards protecting consumer at any cost and at all levels. So today, 10 years ago, when we began deploying networks, high-speed networks 10 years ago, what the regulator wanted was more penetration of the service, better coverage, diminishment of the digital divide, and they would allow you to be more, it would be more lax. And today, what we're seeing is a much better penetration. In Chile, for example, 95% of the people have access to internet, only 60% in fixed, but 95% in mobile. So the overlap allows you to be connected. And the worries of the government have much more to do with consumer protection. And that's also a political issue. It's politicians. We had the social unrest. So today they cannot favor companies many times. They have to favor their voters and clients, and it's very understandable. So we are dealing with a very tough regulation, always increasing its level of protection and transparency. And that's the requirements not only of politicians, but also to us. As companies, we have to review our contracts. We have to be much more transparent. A lot of the requests has nothing to do with regulation. It has to do with self-regulation, because there's a lot of competition. In Chile, even though we don't have that big penetration, most of the households have at least two different fixed wireline service provider. So if you don't behave properly and you don't have a good service, they will shift to another company. So we need to be more transparent, and that's a requirement from a sustainability perspective. Otherwise, your NPS or whatever is the measurement you want on quality of service will be really bad, and will be bad.
All right. So Bronwyn, similar type of question. So Miguel was talking about how the mode of regulation affects how responsive his company can be. The competition, certainly, he feels them breathing down his neck, if you will. and then the customers are just changing very fast. So talk about what is kind of the right modes, the right approaches for regulation in this moment and in preparation for this moment as well.
Well, I think there's some interesting issues there. Competition has been good, and it's not just been about the specification of services. It's also been about how the operators have reacted in the financial world as well, because automatically we've seen immediately all operators in New Zealand and in the United States as well have removed data caps. So customers don't have to fear having had the change demands. They can now access a lot more data than they could previously. So basically every appliance now is, or every account is working on an all-you-can-eat plan. Second, we've seen a lot of flexibility in the firms of actually moving to make it easier for customers. So we've had offers in New Zealand by one firm, for example, not to disconnect or even collect fees from financially stressed customers for up to 6 months. And that's great because it's actually looking at that customer service, given that the internet has now become so essential in keeping connected in this COVID world, the fear of being disconnected for not paying your bill has been taken away. But that's added a huge bunch of new stresses into the system that hadn't been there before. And this relates to access regulation. Now, access regulation has been really good at getting a lot more entry at the retail level, but it's allowed a whole lot of operators to come into the system who don't necessarily have the same financial or balance sheet backing that the fully integrated providers have. And this has added a new stress into the system because unless they've got the huge balance sheets that are attendant to having all of that back office infrastructure, then how do you actually finance the problem of not having your customers paying for 6 months or so? Because if one firm makes that offer, then all firms have to make that offer or they're going to start losing customers. So there's been a huge rethinking there in the system. And in New Zealand, we've gone to the most extreme version in our fixed line networks of access regulation, where we have structural separation. And that's led to a totally different view of what's happening with the ghettoizing of financial risk, because of course the network operators in the fixed line world don't actually have retail customers, so they're not exposed to that risk. But it's all ghettoized in the retail market. Now, for those operators who are hedged because they've also got a mobile network, or maybe they're electricity retailers and have electricity assets, they're able to respond to that. But the vast majority of the retailers that have entered the market have not been diversified like that. They are just effectively reselling, and we're going to see a huge disruption in the competitive face of the market going forward in those areas where we've had a lot of those entrants, just like we saw in the dot-com crash 20 years ago, because they simply cannot afford to deal with that. And that's something that the regulators need to get involved with, because with respect, they created that problem, and there's going to be an issue of where in the industry that debt is going to finally land. And quite rightly, we're seeing the network operators concerned that they're going to end up being saddled with the financial consequences of entry decisions that were none of their making. And that's going to be a huge issue that the industry is having to face going forward because of this response.
All right, well, thank you, Bronwyn. We're going to take questions from the audience now. So audience, please type your questions into the chat. And for the next 15 to 20 minutes, I'll moderate that way. Then we'll open up the mics for you to talk with each other and with our speakers. Our first question comes from Tara. And Miguel, I'll turn to you for this one, then we'll have Bronwyn follow up. So Bronwyn teed up this issue of, in doing really kind things for customers financially, it puts financial stress on the operators. And then there's the stress on the telecom operators, but then there's also the more marginal players. And maybe they make it through this, maybe they don't. Talk with us about that. Describe what you're seeing and how people are trying to cope with it.
You described it very well. At the end of the day, I think that it's been this idea in the state, it was called a pledge. In our case, it's a moratorium law. We have seen it in Panama. We've seen it in Argentina, in Bolivia. In everywhere, we've been seeing packages either by law or through administrative decisions where they are taking utilities and trying to postpone their payments on time, probably 90 days, and giving you a payment period of 12 months. So everybody was thinking like this pandemic is going to last 90 days. So if you unleverage their payments on households, it would be good for economy, we will help them. It's a good theory, I think, but it has some problems with the world of telecommunications, because at least in many of in these countries where you have competition, it's not the same, the monopoly on the electricity, the monopoly of the water, with the competition we see on the telecom market. And Roman was pointing out something that's very important. There are many small companies. For big companies like ours, this is going to be a very difficult moment, because if those laws are passed in full and you keep with number portability, no right to put somebody in a bureau of credits, no enforceable right to collect, you will have a really bad debt crisis for the next, let's say, 12 months, which may affect materially our ability to probably invest on the networks. And these are networks that are consistently investing in CapEx because they're very CapEx intensive, and we live from what we receive from our clients. That's but we will survive. That's definitely, it's going to hurt us. But at the same time, when you go to the fixed world, at least in Chile, you may have 4 or 5 big companies where we're the biggest with 30% of the market, 34% of the market. But when you move to the long tail, you have 100 small companies that move from 20,000 clients to 5,000 clients, to whom a law like that would really take them to a Chapter 11 or Chapter 7, even liquidation, probably, because they won't be able to pay their bills, and it will be very, very difficult. So it's I think the key issue here is, do you have a competition in the segment or don't you? If there is competition, you will have to do a double click if you need those kind of helps, in a way that you guarantee that those postponement of payments will not affect the bad debt.
Okay,
and
thank
that,
you. All right, Bronwyn, same question. What do you see?
Also, that's where the great thing we've seen with countries like the United States. Yes, there might have been some issues with only having a smaller number of operators, but they're in a much better position to make the decisions themselves about how they're going to manage the debt. And they can make decisions about where they make their investment decisions between, say, the mobile or the fixed line platforms. And they've got much more choice over how they manage it. Where we've got a large amount of access regulation, though, and separation of network operations, it's going to be a lot harder. And if we bring regulators in to make these decisions, it's not necessarily going to be the best decisions that get made, because they seem to be a one-size-fits-all. It doesn't allow for the different positions of the different operators with different footprints to be able to manage that themselves. And I think when we're in a crisis like this, a smaller number of diversified operators with a range of different platforms are going to lead to a more stable industry under stress than the more fragmented arrangements that we've got with access regulation. And it's not just an issue for the fixed line networks, because in a lot of countries there are mandatory requirements for mobile MVNO operation as well. And those operators who've come in under MVNO operation regulations are just as exposed as the fixed line operators. So I think it's a great time to rethink some of the reasons where, first of all, we're promoting competition, but thinking about the sort of competition we're promoting. And I think the competition we've got between a smaller number of operators, sort of monopolistic competition or those sorts of elements across the whole value chain, is more robust when stressed by crisis. And from time to time we get these crises. What we're seeing now is in many ways, I think, similar to what we saw in the dot-com, or similar, perhaps exacerbated on what we saw in the dot-com crash. It's exacerbated simply because now we've got, near 100% of the population using the internet back 20 years ago, it was a much smaller percentage of the population, so we had a much lower financial stress, but it's exactly the same sort of issues we saw there. So I would argue that the United States, being the first to hit the disaster point in .com, has learned a lot about that, and that's led to a different approach to regulation, where we've not had a lot of access regulation, but unfortunately the rest of the world has tended to have gone the other way and entered into access regulation across both network platforms, and that's creating a problem that I think is going to take longer for those countries to sort out, will necessarily have regulator engagement, and I'm not confident that it's necessarily going to end up with the best or most robust solutions.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much for that, both of you. We have a question from Emmanuel from Ghana, and thank you, Emmanuel. You're staying up pretty late in Ghana, so thank you for joining us. He would like to know what your recommendations are for countries like Ghana. It's a developing country. You know, there's lots of different financial and other types of struggles that go on. Bronwyn, I know you've done some work in Africa. But let me start with Miguel. As you look around countries that you're familiar with, what's your advice for the regulators in those developing countries?
Oof, it's a tough question, and in this case, I think first of all they really have to understand what is the level of development and what are the real capabilities of those networks. I think that one size doesn't fit all, and probably one of the risks that we're seeing is that the decisions are being copied from what happened in Europe, what happened in Asia and the US, which, by the way, when you look at their networks, they have a lot of free capacity. They have links that are designed with a lot of capacity to cover this overburns of the usage. And I'm not sure that happens in smaller countries where you're dealing with HFC networks, even ADCL networks, where they are navigating at 20 megs, 30 megs, and that's a good plan. In our case, we were at 107 average, so we had space to continue working anyway. When you go to these other countries, giving this lifeline packages, it's really dangerous. First, because you're copying offers in other worlds that appear to be reasonable, but when you look them in comparison with the commercial offers, they're really a lifeline. In our case, we're offering a solidarity plan of 4 megs per client, but the lowest plan we sell is 200 megs, so we're talking of 50 folds the speed, so it's a different quality. But when that same plan is copied in Costa Rica, we're talking of 20, 30 to 4, so it's comparable, and people start moving there, and the financial crisis you can create in these companies is very material. So I would really recommend first understanding what it is about, separating the groups that are more needed, and focusing the help on those ones, and keeping those that can pay during the emergency being able to pay. Otherwise, our companies will suffer too much, and you will lose probably a year of investment where you can't. We are countries that we have to continue investing because our competitive advantage depends on having good networks. So it's incredibly material. And I would say that probably being able to sensibilize or sensitivize the governments that they have to invest on subsidy to lower income people, because this is one of the services that may make a huge difference on the long term on the competitivity of the country.
Thank you. Bronwyn, what are your thoughts?
Well,
I would agree to Ghana or another developing country in Africa.
I would agree with Miguel that if governments are going to put money into this themselves, and also external aid agencies, they should think a lot more about subsidizing people rather than subsidizing network firms, because in many cases that there are capacities there. And the risk at the moment is the capacity that has been invested in just won't be used. But by subsidising people to use the networks, dealing with that financial issue first, will be helpful, and that will lead to an increase in the use of the network capacity that has already been developed. To the extent that new developments are needed, well, in the countries I've dealt with, and also in Pacific Island countries like Papua New Guinea, mobile networks are where all of the movement is at. And I think there's also some of the questions there about the governments and the regulators thinking about competition and thinking about competition, particularly in mobile networks where there isn't a lot in those countries, and whether in fact that if they are going to encourage more development, that it should be through getting more competition at the same time, which can only come by creating more opportunities there, and thinking at the same time as they subsidise people, they also think about their licensing, and they might need to think about some trade-offs of licensing revenue versus the traffic and the ability for competition to happen between mobile networks. Because in those places I've seen where there are 2 or more mobile networks, they have both capacity and resilience. Whereas if there's been a favouring of only one network, then there's likely to be undercapacity and therefore stress.
Okay, so let me ask a follow-up question on that. And I'll come back to you, Miguel, on this. So you talked about, as a first step, you have to really understand kind of state of development, the capabilities of the systems that you have. A lot of times in these countries, it's really hard to get good information from operators. Maybe it's just the record keeping, maybe it's the way management and governance has had it makes it hard, for whatever the reasons. How would you approach that? If you were a regulator, you don't have a lot of information, but you still have to make some really hard decisions. How do you deal with the information problem? How do you deal with the decision-making problem?
Okay. First, I would say that most of the government do have a lot of information. My experience, at least in South America and Central America, is that most of the government have created a registral system where they have to register all the levels of KPIs of the networks. So you're reporting a lot of things. What usually happens is they don't have people to analyze that information. So now you're giving huge amount of information. In my case, for example, we do 39 reports monthly to Subtel, and there's one report that has to do with the full amount of links of the network. So it's 1 million dots in the page. So they have all of the info. Now the question is, do they know where to find it? Do they process it correctly? I think they don't. So I would question if they don't have info. Probably they do have it, but they don't know how to process it correctly. That's one thing. So I would strongly recommend that they hire people that can help them on processing that info. And today there's a lot of good companies that do that. Second, and that's for the long term. For the short term, I would definitely recommend to create a war room with the companies. In my experiences, each time we have faced in the south of the country fires, for example, and fibers are getting cut up and down, we put together workrooms where all the companies go with a technician, a lawyer, or regulatory people, and you put them together, you learn what's going on, you activate companies to work together on repairing fiber, probably sharing resources, and I think that's the best way to get out of a short crisis. So maybe if COVID is going to be a 3 months crisis, but most of the curfews and home lock-ins are going to be shorter, you definitely need to do those teams, because you may have to reinforce links, networks together, and that has worked for us. I think this should be thought the same way in the short term. For the long term, again, more info and a better understanding of where the investment have to go. And by the way, I think that one thing that's been clear in this crisis is that mobile and fixed continue to be quite a different product. When you look at the average consumption of a mobile phone, today for us, postpaid may be on 8 gigabytes. And when you move to a fixed household, they're consuming probably about 50-folds that. So they do different things there. So it's very important that governments support fiber optic and especially the links, so that if you move to a fast way of giving internet through mobile 5G, for example, 4G, you need to have strong backbones because the amount of traffic you need in modern economy is very high.
All right, well, thank you. So yeah, that's been our experience as well, that the technology, the modes that the consumers are choosing are in part driven by their differences in usage. We did a study for the country of Portugal a few years ago and found that while people would substitute mobile and fixed, there are a lot of customers who would not, just because of the types of customers they were. So that's a good point. Bronwyn, what are your thoughts on the information needs? He talked about having some sort of comparative statistics, but then also having the war rooms, which you've heard from countries on energy and water, on telecommunications too. What are your thoughts on those issues?
Well, first of all, I think the information picture is very different in different countries. I've done some work recently in Pacific countries where the most recent information that the regulator had on certain aspects of operation was 5 years old. So I don't think that that's necessarily the same across all countries. I think there's issues about mobile as well, and one of the great things that can happen at the moment that government can get involved with to help is just ensure that spectrum is actually allocated efficiently and it's available to be used. If spectrum is sitting around with operators who aren't in a position to use it, but others can, then at the moment, in order to keep the networks running, moving it around, especially for supporting essential services, is very important. And I think we've seen a lot of initiatives about that, where in fact the firms themselves have been able to work that out and have been able to work out the allocation themselves, but they've just required that regulatory assistance to be able to have permission to be able to move it, especially where there are rules that prevent the on-selling of spectrum. So I think that's something that matters. I think the issue about war rooms, where you have competitors, you will get those war rooms. And I think we also have to be very clear that because these are special times, that we can relax competition law to allow this to happen for that short period of time. And you know, sometimes some regimes perhaps might be less flexible about relaxing competition law than others. I think at this time we do have to step back and recognise that working together has to happen in the short run, despite the war on collusion we've had in the past.
Yeah.
So I think that's again where the governments can use their lawmaking powers and their enforcement powers in a flexible manner to help the operators get around this, because in the end, it's the operators that have the information. They know what they're doing. They're best placed to know how to move that around, and they should be helped over this period to do that. Of course, the problem is once you relax something, you've got to look at the long term of what you do when you now have to bring those constraints back in. And that's going to be quite a challenge, because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, it's pretty hard to put it back in again. So I think that will lead to, I would hope that that might lead to a very much more collaborative and bottom-up development of future regulation coming from the industry upwards, and much more industry promoted rather from the bottom up rather than the top down. But that's an aspiration. Whether that will happen remains to be seen.
All right, well, thank you very much. So we're now at the point where I'd like to open the mics and let people ask their questions or engage in discussions directly. So Sam, I'll turn that over to you, and Johannes Bauer already has a question. Maybe we could just let him lead us off in this mode.
Sure, yes, so thank you very much. So for this section of for this portion of the session, we'll just go ahead and ask that you please raise your hand, and then I will unmute your audio. Feel free to unmute your video if you'd like to share. In order to do that, to raise your hand, for those of you using a laptop or a desktop, please go to the bottom of the toolbar, like on the Zoom page, and you'll see there it has like an icon where you can raise your hand. For those of you who are using a phone or a tablet, you'll find the toolbar along the top of the screen. And then, like I said, please just raise your hand and I will be more than happy to unmute you. You share your video if you'd like, and then share your stories with us.
Okay. Johannes?
Well, thanks, Mark. Hi, everybody. Hi, Bronwyn.
Hello, Johannes.
And hi, Miguel. We have not met, but nice to meet you. So I had, you mentioned in passing wireless, and my question was related to the a complementarity between fixed and wireless networks. What do you, everybody is currently sort of excited and eager to invest in 5G networks and expand that capacity. Do you have any guesses how the current crisis might affect those investment plans? And they're complementary to fixed. You need backhaul to really have an efficient 5G network. What's your view of the crystal ball, how this will develop?
It's a really tough question, because probably one of the biggest question marks in the industry is how are you going to put together a business plan that can pay the huge investments that 5G requires to give all the technical promise that they offer, and I don't know how that's going to happen. What I do know is that this differentiation between mobile and fixed it's definitely going to be disappearing, because 5G is going to be an overload it's going to do an overload over fiber. Otherwise, it won't be able to comply with the promise it was. How are you going to have the time that you need to send the packages? You're talking of less than 4 or 5 milliseconds to really have telemedicine working right. Capacity is going to be an issue. So there's so many things that you will need to have a strong fixed network below this last 5G mile, that what we're thinking is probably they're all going to tend to merge fixed and mobiles, and you will have to have conglomerates that usually will have both worlds inside. And the other thing is probably you will have to share a lot of infrastructure. Not sure big countries, but definitely small countries like Chile, where we have a very long country, people very isolated. If you want to cover them all, you will definitely have to have more collaborative networks that have, on one hand, the resilience that you need, the capacity that you need, but doesn't have we keep competition, but we have to cover cost and keep them at the level that we're able to pay them, and that's a really tough thing. So probably we're going to see more mergers in the future. A lot of work for free competition bodies, because I agree with the genie out of the bottle. It's extremely risky, and we've had old experiences that are bad. But on the other hand, we have to learn to work more collaboratively and keep competition going. Otherwise, countries poorer than or like Chile that are not really high-income countries won't be able to keep the path of Asian, European, and American countries, and we need to do that.
Okay, thank you, Miguel. Bronwyn, what do you think about the prospects for 5G?
Well, obviously, the huge balance sheet pressures that the telcos are coming under can't help but change the time plan that we would have had otherwise for 5G. I think we do have to be very careful when we're looking at 5G development as well, because of the greater need for integration between the front end and the back ends, that we look very carefully again at structural separation and access regulation type worlds, because those sorts of regulations are not necessarily going to be fit for purpose in the 5G world. But of course, that's a luxury we'll only be able to get to if we can afford to go down that path. And unfortunately, for some countries, the economic hit is going to be so substantial, it's going to be very difficult. So I think there's some responsibility there for looking at this as not just a local single country problem, but a worldwide problem about how we manage to get that going, because obviously there are issues that happen across 5G. It's integrated not just within the network, but also across those locations. So I think it's both an opportunity but also a threat that happens with the fragmentation that's happening across the industry between the different blocks of the development of the technology as well. So I think we've got quite a lot of challenges there going forward.
All right, thank you. Sam Antoinette has our next question, and she's facing the opposite type of a problem with 5G. So could we let her have her microphone, please?
Sure, absolutely, yes. Antoinette, can you hear us? Antoinette?
Hello?
Hi,
Hello?
yes, okay. Hi, yes, can you hear us?
Yes. So
Yes, I was just curious as to whether anyone is grappling with all the 5G hysteria in certain quarters.
So what's the hysteria that you're experiencing?
All the controversy theories and viral videos, and I know they're debunked, but still you are dealing with consumers. And, you know, just reading about towers being under attack and the like, I was just curious.
Okay. Yeah. So some countries, some situations, there are people believe that 5G is causing the coronavirus. How does anyone cope with that?
We've seen some of that in Jamaica. We've had a few damages on our network, especially mobile, based on 5G, and we haven't even deployed 5G. So I tend to agree with Antoinette that there was a misinformation and people took it seriously. And I think COVID is really frightening a lot of people, so some of them get panicked really easy. But yes, we've seen some of those attacks, and we have approached governments to try to get somebody that also backs up the real storytelling that this, first of all, they're not deployed, and second, this doesn't produce COVID. But it has happened.
Yeah. Is that happening in your part of the world, Bronwyn?
Not so much in our part of the world, but I think data and education, I mean, these things have to go on as well. And suggesting to people that if we're going to deal with that, then perhaps we should also remove their microwave ovens might help restore a little bit of sanity there.
Okay, very good.
Hello,
So
Mark.
anyone else have their hand up?
Hello, Mark.
Go ahead, please.
Hello. Okay, good day all. My name is Adamu Magaji from Nigeria. I worked with MTN Nigeria Telecommunications Company, and quite interesting session. Sorry for logging in late due to the time difference. Well, for us, 5G, we run a trial of the 5G network in Nigeria last year. It was a very huge task, and it requires huge investment. The fiber deployment in Nigeria, our fiber penetration is at almost 14%, which is quite low. And for us to roll out 5G, yes, we have the technology, we have the expertise to do that. We have shown the regulatory, and it requires huge investment, especially on the access transport system and the core network. That is where the main work is. But with the E-band, the 70 to 80 gigahertz band, you know, you can still transport some level of 5G data, but that still will not meet the requirement for 5G. Because for the trial that we conducted, it requires up to like 20 gigabits capacity to site for each of the 5G. Well, with regards to your question, in Nigeria also we face that issue of coronavirus, that 5G is causing the coronavirus. And it actually affected our fiber rollout. We have this big fiber rollout project, and a lot of state governments stopped us from working because they are saying that the fiber deployment we are doing on the ground is that we are burying some cables that will cause coronavirus to people. So it really affected our fiber penetration project. So it's quite a challenging for the industry as well. But I believe as time goes on, at least there is light at the end of the tunnel. So in this part of the world, we are also facing that similar challenge in Africa. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Adamu.
Yeah.
Anyone else have their hands up? Well, we're about out of time, so I'll ask the last question. And so Bronwyn, I'll begin with you, then we'll go to Miguel on this. So if you put on your crystal, take out your crystal ball, and you look 6 months from now, and we look back, how do you think that we'll assess how we all did during this crisis? Assuming it's kind of wrapped up in 6 months, it may not be.
Well, I think from the immediate effect of lockdowns and those issues, I think we'll look back, and I hope we'll actually congratulate our network operators for the fantastic job they did of keeping us going as best as we could under the circumstances, because this sort of event, even 10 years ago, would have been economically far more devastating with the inability for people to be able to connect than what we've got now. So I hope we'll be thankful for what we have had and thankful for the pieces that work. Of course, unfortunately, the 20% of things that didn't work will end up taking 80% of the energy into the future. But I think that will mean that the agenda for what we can do in the future will never be bigger than it's ever been before. So that has to be good from both a research perspective and from this perspective of the firms for the opportunities to go out and do bigger, better and brighter things into the future.
All right, thank you. Miguel, how do you think we're going to judge ourselves?
Oof, I think that that people will realize that the world changed and that the digital economy is going to be here forever. And this was a catalyst of a process that would have taken us probably 2 years, 3 years. And most of the companies will do the investments and won't stay here waiting that this is a peak that will pass when people go back to work. We will do the investments. So if we're able to show that to the public and to show that to the government so that they highlight that, I think that Bronwyn's view is going to be possible. Otherwise, if we're not able to first do those investments, we may be facing a lot of criticisms because qualitative service was not at par with the need, and even class actions sometimes because clients want everything right now and they really need it. But I'm optimistic, so I think they will recognize that it worked and that we have a new economy and that we were lucky that investment had been done before and the crisis wasn't that bad as it would have been 2 years ago.
All right, well, very good. So let me just thank both of you for sharing your part of your morning, part of your evening with us. Greatly appreciated. And thank you to all the participants that were here as well. People asked the questions and those of you just listening in.